Welcome to this video as part of elements of mission and evangelism to lead us into session 3 when we're thinking about the mission and the Bible. So in this video, we're going to think particularly about the Missio Dei again, the mission of God and the Bible. And this is partly because of an Old Testament scholar and mission thinker, Chris Wright, who was once asked to lead a seminar on the biblical basis of mission. And he wasn't sure that that's actually what he wanted to talk about, the biblical basis of mission, because the idea was that you should look to bits of the Bible to give you a basis for thinking about and practicing mission. But he wanted to think about it another way around. And instead he chose to give the seminar on the missional basis of the Bible, which might sound strange, but he was making 2 points. First of all, that mission came first and the Bible resulted. So a little bit more about that. Mission came first and the Bible resulted. The point that he was making was that the people of God in Hebrew scriptures, but before the scriptures, the people of God were already engaging in mission. They were already trying to live out God's purposes in the world in response to and participating with the missional God. So mission activity was what they were engaged in first of all, and out of those contexts, the biblical texts emerged. So for example, the exile as a key event in the history of the people of God, that the exile was such a significant event that so many texts of the Old Testament as we have it are reckoned to have come out of that context. Either they were the time when Jewish people gathered together oral traditions and wrote them down, or it was such an event that it caused the Israelites to rethink about their own purpose and identity. So the experience of the exile caused them to clarify who they were, to think it through again, and to write texts as a result. And the prophets, many of the prophets were engaging with the question of the exile in the run up to it, in the wake of it. So the event came first and the texts emerged afterwards. Or if we think in the New Testament, of course, Paul's letters and the other letters were written in response to things that were happening on the ground, what the churches were struggling with in their own life and in their engagement with their communities and cultures. So the letters were a response to missional practice coming first. Also the Gospels didn't just appear from nowhere. They were texts that came out of particular Christian communities living out their faith and needing to be reminded of the stories of Jesus in order to energize and animate their life together. So missional practice came first and the biblical material followed. So the missional basis of the Bible. And it's because of that, because mission exists behind the Bible, it's because of that it makes sense to read the text of Scripture with mission in mind. It's no surprise that mission occurs again and again through Scripture, because that was the context that is being expressed through the texts. Here's some quotes from Chris Wright that sort of help to elaborate this point. The whole Bible is itself a missional phenomenon, i.e. it comes out of missional contexts, so no wonder it speaks to missional contexts. The Bible is a missional phenomenon in the sense that it witnesses to the self-giving movement of this God towards his creation and towards us human beings. In other words, there's already the activity of mission going on in God's movement towards us and in God calling us to participate with God. And so the Bible witnesses to that, the missional basis of Scripture following. And this quote is also fascinating, I think, that the original audience for the New Testament was not a catechism class. In other words, it's not just a sort of guidebook for teaching people things, or a seminary, or a context where church leaders are being trained. It was an entire religious movement, living a missionary life, spreading a missionary message. So the texts of the New Testament were there to sort of enable and facilitate and energize people who were engaged in mission. Mission came first, the texts were a resource to enable it and to respond to it. So it's in that context that Wright also says mission is not just one of the things that the Bible happens to talk about. Mission is what it's all about. And you might well debate that a little bit. I think, has he slightly overstated his case? Is every single text of Scripture a response to and a resource for mission? Perhaps not every single text, but still the big picture that he's making there is quite persuasive. What do you make of it? Second thing that Chris Wright is getting at when he speaks about the missional basis of the Bible is that he's saying that the Bible witnesses to, it tells the story of a number of agents engaged in mission. And first of all, that the first agent is God. God's self is missional, as we've seen before in the Missio Dei idea. God's activity through the very business of creation itself is missional, by creating an other to engage with and love. God calls people to join with God. God covenants with communities. God calls us to be co-workers with God. In all of this, God is being missional. So a quote from Chris Wright: to adopt a missiological hermeneutic, in other words, a way of reading Scripture and a way of interpreting it, which has mission in mind, is to accept that the biblical worldview locates us in the midst of a narrative of the universe behind which stands the mission of the living God. A very grand statement in a sense, but basically the idea is that the Bible tells us a big story behind which, or active within it, is the very mission of God as the first agent of mission. We turn from God as the primary, the first agent of mission, to what Chris Wright is also saying about how Scripture reveals a number of witnesses, how it witnesses to a number of agents in mission. And the second sort of category engaged in mission is humanity, but humanity at large. And that he argues that humanity is called to represent God. The notion of us being made in the image of God is not simply a sort of abstract idea of us having something imprinted on us about the nature of God being within our nature, but it's also about our calling and purpose to live as representatives of God, and therefore to care for creation as God cares for creation. Some people speak about this, to use another fancy Latin phrase, as the missio humanitatis, that there's something intrinsic to being human that means we are missional. We have a part in God's mission, not just because we are Christians, for instance, but because we are human beings. Such a striking idea. But then Chris Wright then says that the next agents in mission, sort of narrowing down more specifically, as the people of God understood as Israel, and that they have a calling to be a particular people because humanity at large, in a sense, is struggling to live out this general sense of being representatives of God on earth. So Israel has a more focused calling to be a light to the nations, to be representatives of God's activity and purposes in and for creation. Israel's election, he says, was not a rejection of other nations, but was explicitly for the sake of all nations. This universality of God's purposes that embraces the particularity of God's chosen means is a recurrent theme. So there he's saying that the choosing of Israel, it's not about Israel being God's favourites, but it's calling them to live out a special purpose in order to witness to and to be an example for the other nations. So it's a big picture calling, but it's expressed in a particular commitment and relationship with Israel. And that whole idea of calling particular people to be representatives for the whole is a recurring theme throughout the Scriptures. But then he says the next agent is Jesus, because Israel itself is also struggling to witness to and to fulfill its purposes within creation. So he says that Jesus has a particular mission. It's worth pondering for a moment what exactly that mission might be. We might take it for granted that we know what Jesus' mission is. But Chris Wright suggests that first of all, actually, Jesus has a mission to Israel, to call it to its purposes, to be a light to the nations. But also Jesus is called to embody God's purposes, to be a focus, the intensity of God's presence and purpose on earth for the sake of all of the earth. There's an embodiment and a focus in Jesus. And then we turn to the church, that in the light of and in the wake of Jesus' ministry and mission, the church is also called to participate and to witness to God's mission. Again, it's something we perhaps take for granted, the sense that, well, we already know what the church's mission is. But as Chris Wright is sort of saying, that the biblical witness encourages us not to take it for granted, to seek it out again and again, to understand it in the light of Jesus' own mission, which itself should be understood in the light of this history of mission that came before him as well, to witness to God's purposes for the whole of creation and to share in Jesus' mission, who embodied it in his person and in his life. So Chris Wright is making an argument there about the whole of the Bible witnessing to a number of agents engaged in mission. First God, then humanity at large, then Israel as a more focused calling, then in the person of Jesus, and then spreading out again to the church. But as with Israel, which sometimes it needed help to understand its own calling, sometimes help from outsiders, so potentially with the church too. Perhaps outsiders play a role in helping the church to rediscover what our calling is. There's an interesting sort of dynamic that goes on within Scripture. It's not always insiders who understand it best. Sometimes it's people on the margins or outside who help to reveal to those inside what it is that God is calling them to be. And perhaps that's something that we learn from Jesus himself in the way he was missional in and amongst those on the margins, receiving their stories and their capacity for faith and purpose as much as sort of going to them. So these are a few thoughts about the role of Scripture and its missional basis, and we can think more about this when we meet together.